My name is Samir Dev. Today my guest is Shireesh Joshi, Chief Business Officer at Online Network for Digital Commerce. Welcome, Shireesh. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Shireesh, as I was mentioning to you before we started this interview, I was in Europe recently, and there were a lot of questions regarding all the new changes that are happening in India. And that was really the key idea behind this particular podcast. I thought it was great to speak to people like you and bring this out and share it with the global world in terms of some of the new digital ideas that are happening in India. So with that, let's start on ONDC, Open Network for Digital Commerce. Can you give me some background on the germination of this idea? How was this conceptualized?
Yeah. So the genesis was actually 2020 and the first wave of the pandemic. And the India government, like any other country at that time, without a vaccine in sight, without knowledge of how lethal it was, the only way to contain was lock down the population. And when you lock down 1.4 billion people, then the question automatically arises, how will they access their necessities, their food, their medicines? And at that time, the penetration of e-commerce in the country was a bare 2%. And so when people are used to physical commerce and they're physically restricted, then that was the barrier that the government was looking to solve. Now, thankfully, that lockdown didn't last long and we got a little bit more time to get this right. But that was the question to which ONDC is the answer on how do we create a method by which an entire nation can be connected to e-commerce.
Got it. And is this run by private individuals? Is it a private sector undertaking? It sits within the government. How does this function?
So the structure is interesting. It's a category called a Section 8 company. It's a private sector company. So more than 51% of the ownership is with private investors. And it's a Section 8 company, meaning there is no dividend, there is no listing, there is no capital gain. So although the people contributing are called shareholders as the correct term, but it's actually more like a donation because there really is no return and it's a contribution to nation building. It's distributed and it was by invitation. So private banks, HDFC, ICICI, Axis, Kotak, public banks, State Bank of India, PNB, Bank of Baroda, Bombay Stock Exchange, National Stock Exchange, Small Industries Development Bank of India, NABARD, which is for Rural Development Bank. So these were some of the institutions that invested for the project to take off, and indeed for us as an organization to be formally established.
And what attracted you to this opportunity? I mean, you've always been a private sector individual. I followed your career. I've known you for a very long time. So what was attractive about this opportunity?
Actually, the entire company of now a little more than 100 plus people are all private sector history employees, every single one. And they all come from big names. They come from the e-commerce companies, they come from technology companies, they come from banks, they come from multinationals, all coming from big name private sector companies. So we're all private sector company working in a private sector organization, but doing a project whose purpose is government's project for the nation. So that's an unusual combination.
And it's been working great. It's been 3 years, 4 years now since this exercise came into existence?
So since the question was first asked, yes, it's been 4 years, but it was about 1.5 years when the contours of how it is right now actually fell into place. And it began with setting up of an advisory board, people who had worked within technology, in finance, in public infrastructure at various levels. Some of them are international names like Nandan Nilegani, people from Digital India and so on. So these were the group of people who were the initial think tank, if you will, of getting started. And then appointed a person as a leader of the project. Mm-hmm. For a few months, we were like just a collection of people he pulled together, working on our own time. There was no formal organization, formal structure. It was a daily call on which we would just talk what needed to be done. We got formally set up as the Section 8 company in December of 21. And the infusion of funds happened over the next couple of months. The project leader got formally appointed as the MD. And then those of us who were till that time in conversations for various topics and picking up work streams, we became formal employees from April of 22. So formal organization for a couple of years.
That's pretty interesting. Okay, let's talk about what ONDC does. Who is your audience? who are your typical users, and what are you trying to build? How does this ecosystem work? Because that has generated tremendous curiosity amongst international investors. When I speak to them, they've heard a bit about UBI, they've heard a bit about ONDC, but these are acronyms. So if you could throw a little bit of light in terms of what these concepts are and who's really going to benefit from this would be helpful.
Yeah. So there is a growing thread of projects and solutions that are now coming together in India, variously called as India Stack or Digital Public Infrastructure or Digital Public Goods. It began with Aadhaar, which was the first digital biometric identity for pretty much the entire nation. Till that time, we had a variety of documents, a passport, driving license, voter ID. They still exist and they still can be used legally as a identity. But pretty much everyone now has an Aadhaar card, and in most cases when you have to prove your identity, you're actually first asked for Aadhaar card. It's almost like a Pavlovian question with a Pavlovian response. Here it is, right? And so it's pretty much become the thing. On the back of it, then the next thing happened, which is there used to be a time where to open a bank account, you needed a letter of introduction from an existing account holder of that bank.
Remember that?
Now the Aadhaar became government's introduction letter for everyone. And so bank accounts got open at scale, and a journey that is estimated, if we had followed the penetration to GDP curve, it would have taken us 47 years to get to 80% of people having bank accounts. We got there in 7 years because of this digitization. Once the bank accounts happened and they were digital, then the ability to transfer money from one digital bank account to another bank account could happen at population scale. And that was the genesis of UPI, where two parties with accounts in two different banks using two different applications on the same protocol could then do this bank-to-bank transfer. And collectively, both the industry and the government set the MDR at 0, because in order for it to be adopted, it needed to be literally equal to cash. So if I'm going to pay 100 rupees and if the other party is going to receive 99.5, it's not quite like cash. And then people start thinking, is it worth it? But if I send 100 and the other party receives 100, then it's literally exactly like cash. And so partly the simplicity of the construct, because anybody with a phone knows how to take pictures. So therefore, it's very easy to scan a QR code and all you have to do is enter an amount. That's all you need to know. There is no need to understand somebody's bank account or SWIFT or an IFSC code, add as a beneficiary, wait for 24 hours. That used to be the digital payment method earlier. Right. Now all you have to do is scan a QR code, enter the amount and send, and money goes from your bank account to the other party's bank account. So that simplicity and meeting the security requirements that the Reserve Bank required. So that's what helped take it off. So now these are becoming building blocks for the country. A couple of other building blocks that are coming up. One is related to data. So there is a DigiLocker where our driving license, passport, etc. are present. There is now also a consent artifact. So there is a service called Account Aggregator, where based on your consent, a limited amount of your financial history can be shared with appropriate party. So these now become building blocks that can be combined to create a new layer of service. So first, I think anybody from outside the country needs to understand is none of these are one-off projects. These are all projects that connect with each other and are able to generate new services while expanding what they stand for. So now the identity has become the basis for eKYC. And KYC used to be a very expensive process, both for the party doing it and for the individual. You have to take various documents, take photocopies, make sure they're clean, get them in order, travel somewhere, deposit them, and then for the other party to process it. So all of that has gone away through a few clicks and your fingerprint as your identity.
Got it. So now when we come to the typical users of ONDC, how does this work? Guide us through the process.
Yeah. So I think ONDC is very hard to understand, not because the idea is difficult, but because the idea is so radical from what we are used to. And therefore, I think what will be helpful is to actually talk about a couple of analogies first, and then come to ONDC. So let's talk about telephones. Like you're sitting in Singapore, I'm sitting in India. You have a different telecom operator, I have a different telecom operator.
Right.
But when I have to call you, all you do is you give me a number and I just simply dial it and I reach you. And same is true for any phone in the world.
Yeah.
And as more people get devices and take SIM cards from whatever operator they take it from and stick it in, we can call them, they can call us. Correct. This is an open network. I don't have to be registered, or my SIM does not have to be registered in your telephone company for me to be able to call you. We take that for granted. Right? This is an open network and interoperable where any party can call anyone. Banking is also interoperable. That if I have to send you money, let's say using SWIFT, you and I don't have to have an account in the same bank. All it requires, both our banks are on the SWIFT network, and that network helps us transfer that money. So these are open networks where parties can be in different applications or in different organizations. E-commerce today doesn't function like that. All e-commerce anywhere in the world requires the buyer and seller to be in the same platform or the same app. When you make that requirement, then that's what leads to the current market structures, which essentially leads to one or two players becoming large and that concentration of economic power. That's the structure that takes place, and it has taken place country after country. There are only 5 or 6 companies globally that control most of e-commerce. In India, a couple of companies pretty much dominate the product e-commerce. If you go to food delivery, again, only a couple of players. Go to ride-hailing, again, really only a couple of players. So the structure of a platform which requires scale on both the buyer or the shopper side and on the provider side invariably leads to just a couple of players becoming sizable. That's the e-commerce structure and a couple of examples of open network. Let me use one final example of an open network because that comes closest. The internet is an open network, and think about internet in 5 parts. Somebody who's using the internet, a user, a human being is one part. That human being cannot directly see internet or hear the internet with their eyes and ears. They need a browser. So there's a digital software called a browser that allows this human to access the vast amount of services and information on the internet. That's on the user side. On the creator side, there is a publisher of information, publisher of content, creator of service, who's created a service and hosted it on some web platform with some CMS and technology. So you have 2 humans using digital or technical platforms, and the conversation between these 2 technical platforms takes place through a protocol called HTTPS. So there is a protocol, and then there is a DNS registry that tells how parties can be found. Now, if you think of these 5 parts, the exact same thing translates to ONDC. So instead of a user, you have a shopper. Instead of a publisher, you have a seller. The shopper uses an equivalent of browser called a buyer application. A seller hosts their catalog on the equivalent of a web hosting platform called a seller application. And the protocol through which we talk is ONDC. So ONDC at its heart is a protocol and a registry. Now, some of the things that you don't see in e-commerce, you will now start to see here. For example, on the internet, there is no browser that can say, I will show you more websites than the other browser. Such a thing is just not possible. On ONDC, the same is true. From a single buyer application, you will see all the sellers. The distinction between 2 buyer applications is not the number of sellers they can show or the number of items they can show. It's only the experience. Right? And the ability for somebody to use scale as a stranglehold for the users now is gone. Because just as easily you can switch from one browser to another, you can switch from one buyer application to another and still access the same sellers and same products. Same on the seller side. A seller, if for whatever reason is hosted on one particular platform, says that this platform service is not good, too expensive, whatever reason, simply shifts to a different one, they still have access to the entire world of buyers that exist. Right? Much like you might just say in your SIM card, change your telephone operator, you can still call everybody. It isn't, if I leave this big operator and go to a small operator, I will only be able to call a few people. So I think some of the principles that we see in phone networks, in banking, and that are the result of such an open architecture, now we will start to see in commerce. So 2 principles, unbundling, which is everything is not done by one party. One party could do only buyer side activity, one party could do only seller side activity, somebody else could provide only logistics. So you reduce the e-commerce to building blocks and then allow companies to combine them in whichever way. So there is a flexible model of doing e-commerce. That is what is already, even at a small scale and a 2-year life, we are seeing entities that could never have been on e-commerce are becoming part of e-commerce as a result.
I mean, the way you simplify, it also almost says that as simple as the concept is, equally radical and should change the way we look at internet and how we consume services and how we actually do our shopping. And the whole online experience will obviously change over the next couple of years. Few questions come to my mind. Now, you did make a mention that there are service providers, the big players like the Amazons of the world. I recently read that Amazon is looking to participate on ONDC. So how does this work? You've got a private player now coming and putting his marketplace on this open net. So how's this going?
So first, the marketplace has to unbundle. Right. So a marketplace like Amazon has a user base, that's one side of it, has a pool of sellers, that's the other side of it. That has to be unbundled and brought independently.
Right.
Now, let's first talk about the benefits. So once you join a network, let's say you just simply bring your buyer first. So we do not require that both sides come together. We do require both sides come eventually, but they can come sequentially, not necessarily together. So if you bring your buyer universe to the network, then those buyers can now buy things that currently are not possible on your network.
Right.
For example, on a product e-commerce like Amazon, you can't order restaurant food. You can't book a taxi. There are so many products and services. That's because they're specialized in that. So e-commerce ends up specializing in a particular area. There is an app for everything, but there is no literally app for everything, which is very different from how internet works. Right? All the activities you do on the internet, you basically use one browser. You don't need a browser for video and a browser for work and a browser for email and a browser for research. No, you have one browser that does everything. So that's the change that will take place. Now, any business, and especially one that is at scale but not profitable, the first thing you get taught is, can you juice your assets for more revenue? Either lower your costs or grow your revenue. And the simplest thing is take your buyers and get them to buy more stuff than you are able to sell. And get your sellers to sell to more buyers than you have been able to accumulate.
Yeah.
And no one organization, no matter how big, no matter how capable, no matter how rich, can accumulate everyone. The internet got to where it did because so many different millions of organizations around the world in various sectors collectively contributed to making it.
Okay.
So the scale of an open network will always surpass that of a closed network. So it benefits even a big player to join, especially in a market that is so underpenetrated. So at the time COVID hit and the idea of what became ONDC was conceived, the e-commerce penetration was just 2%. 3 years later, thanks to COVID, it has tripled. But tripled still means only 6%. There's still 94% of the economy that is undigitized. That's a huge opportunity for any player. So you can choose to play a certain way, in a certain format, in a certain model, and dominate that. Or you can choose to play at a much broader level. There is also a flip side, Samit, which is that there is also a risk if you don't join.
Right.
Because none of the sellers or buyers are simply going to wait. And by the way, you as a shopper, I'm sure, on multiple shopping platforms, as am I. So anyone, once they join the network, I can shop everything I need through that platform. So whoever waits too long will actually lose the uniqueness of the scale that they have built. So there is a benefit to join and a risk to not joining. And some have begun. So while Amazon has not yet joined, so all of them have communicated publicly that they're in favor and they understand how this is powerful. But they're in various stages of figuring out their model and joining. In the meantime, a ride-hailing company, Ola, has now joined our network. And they're enabling ride-hailers to order food on the network. And so you have now opened a second revenue stream. Very simply, it's taken a couple of engineers maybe and a few days of work. And voila, you have a new revenue stream that is live. So that's how platforms are benefiting. We have Snapdeal, which is a fashion home products platform, mainly for tier 2, tier 3 cities in the country. They have become part of the network, both as a buyer side and a seller side. So their sellers are now able to sell to additional buyers, and their buyers are able to buy more products. Now, being a mid-small tier town city, they didn't have some of the big brands. But on our network, big brands are either coming themselves or are being brought by other parties. So now Snapdeal buyers can buy all the brands that even Snapdeal didn't have earlier.
Very interesting. Very keen to some of the super apps that we've seen in Asia getting developed. We had companies like Grab who started as a ride-hailing and then went into food delivery app. But as you rightly said, it was still gated within the property of Grab only. Whereas here, those walls are essentially broken down and it enables everyone to transact across the platform. I mean, it's fascinating the more you learn about it. How has this grown? I mean, considering it's a 4-year, 5-year kind of a history, but I hear the numbers are fascinating. So give me some numbers. How has this grown?
So we started real world testing in April, literally end of April 22. That's when the first test order got done. There was a small bunch of coriander that was bought from a terrace farm in Bangalore to actually one of our team members as the first test order. Okay. For about a few months, we were still testing with the invitational orders. And in September, we opened it up to the public for the first time in a few pin codes of Bangalore. Okay. Since then, we now have moved to getting orders from more than 800 cities. January last year, we were doing about 50 orders a day. Now we do 250,000 orders a day. Last week, only had some restaurants and grocery stores on the network. Today, we have fashion stores, electronic stores, home and kitchen stores. We have auto rickshaws and taxis. We now have even metro train on the network. We have farmers on the network. We're doing not just B2C transaction, we're also doing B2B transaction. And interestingly enough, we've also done our first international transaction.
Which country, I may ask, this has happened with?
So this has happened with Singapore, and it was an outcome of the two countries meeting and agreeing cooperation, which initially began as the financial sector conversation. So Monetary Authority of Singapore and RBI initially picking that up. But as they looked for a use case and wanted to help small and medium enterprises do international trade, part of it was around credit and part of it was around assistance in commerce. And so ONDC got presented as a test case to try out. And so one of the entities that MAS has invested in became the Singapore Buyer application. A Spinelli Cafe in Singapore placed an order for a tea consignment on Chaiyom in India through the network. So that was the test case that's gone through. So now we're working with Proxtera to do more POC orders to make sure that the rails are working. And thereafter, we'll begin to scale up at least that sector. We have interest from other countries also, but we're taking it slowly one by one.
So that was going to be my follow-up question. Am I right to say that this kind of setup at this juncture primarily exists in India, or have you seen this model in any other country who has adapted and is already working on this?
So no one's taken commerce to an open network. Everywhere, commerce is largely private sector enterprises who build their own platforms for various use cases. So this is really a world first in that sense. But as with this example now, we have one case of cross-border, and we do have more than passing interest from a couple of more countries. So there are organizations who have said that we will become participants on the network and enable transactions from our cities or our country. And so those are the early days of conversation.
And are you seeing adaptability towards the financial services sector, especially banks, insurance companies, so forth, so on?
That's about to explode, I think. We have one financial product live right now, which is gift cards. That's like a prepaid gift voucher that you can give someone. But we've just done a few pilot tests of loans and unsecured personal loan. We've done about 20 odd test transactions. We're able to complete that entire process in under 10 minutes. So loans will become available. Mutual funds will become available. Insurance products will become available. And of course, we expect that the first set of products are products that are available even outside of a network, standard products. But once they're on a network, then we see opportunity for creation of products related to our network. One of the pool of sellers that we are bringing in are actually remote rural artisans, handicraftsmen, farmers. They've never done remote distant commerce, let alone do digital commerce. Now, for them to participate, there would be business risk. So we could one day have a very small sachet insurance product for a very small player in a remote part of the country to be able to cover their digital transaction risk. Just one example of how new things could emerge. And they can simply add to cart like they add everything else that they're buying to the cart. So it should be that simple.
So Shireesh, we were talking about financial services, and one of the key questions that comes to mind is data privacy. That's a big topic. And obviously with so many users joining in, so many merchants, a lot of information, you guys are custodians of a lot of data. So how are you dealing with this? Is this an issue? What kind of checks and balances have been put in place?
Sure. So the first check and balance we put in is actually to not be custodian of data. So actually we have very little. We know, for example, number of transactions taking place, but we do not know the item bought. We do not know who bought it. And all we know is the locations in which that transaction happened. That's it. The idea is to keep it that way. So anything that is personally identifiable, anything that is competitive information, we will neither have and nor ask. What we are though doing is we are creating a method, what we're calling open data ledger, where the participants will contribute their data in much the same way some sectors around the world do, so that there is an aggregate information that's available as a industry information for everyone. But we don't keep any data. That's fundamental to the design.
Oh, that helps. So my data is safe, and I'm not handing over any of my credit card details or my IC details to you guys, which I take comfort from.
Yeah. So your payment details will be given to whatever payment gateway is embedded and you've chosen to use.
Yeah.
And your information will only go to the seller. So if, let's say, buying an insurance product, then your information will go to the insurance company, which it needs to. They need to validate who you are before they can give you that insurance. So only as required by law, but we will not have that information.
As a user and of course as merchants, there are many things that I look at when I go for my online experience, right? The ability to exchange, manage late deliveries, damaged goods, how easily can I send them? And that enhances my experience. If I have a good experience with a particular site, then obviously I'm going to go back to that. Even one bad experience and that kind of completely takes me off and removes me from that particular ecosystem of that particular vendor, essentially. So
right.
in ONDC, how is this going to get handled? Because who has the ownership? Who's going to be responsible for this? And how do you make sure that matchmaking happens in an effortless way?
So again, let me take a couple of experiences that I think most people would have had, and that will help understand. Let's take money transfer. Let's say, Samir, I'm sending you some money. So I use the SWIFT system. I'm an account with my bank here. You have a bank in Singapore with which you have an account. I send you money and you tell me you didn't receive it. Now, there are three parties involved. My bank, the SWIFT network, and your bank.
Right.
There is no line for the SWIFT network. Right? I don't look up a customer care for SWIFT and look it up. I don't know your bank. The only party I know is the bank that I interacted with. So I will raise the issue with my bank. They will figure out. I've forgotten what the name of that report was. They will provide me with that, and we'll be able to track down what happened. So you deal with the party you've dealt with. Other parties in the chain you've not dealt with, but your bank has a right and a mandate to be able to interact with them and figure it out. Right? So that's one example. The second example is when you go to a holiday and you make arrangements through a travel agent.
Right.
So you have bought an airline ticket, hotel booking, some tour of a particular city you're visiting. All of that is bought through a travel agent. If anything goes wrong there, you will talk to your travel agent and you'll get them to fix it, right?
Yeah.
And so whenever you have a situation where there is an unbundling of the chain, then whichever party is the one that you have dealt with to place the order, that's who you go to. So same with ONDC. A buyer will place an order on a buyer application. The buyer application will transmit your requirement to the network. From the network, variety of sellers from various seller applications will respond. The buyer application will present them to you. You will sort, filter, eventually select and add to cart and go ahead with the transaction. If you have a question or a problem, you will raise it with your buyer application. And then your buyer application has a lot of ability on the protocol itself to be able to relay error messages, relay questions for the other party to respond. Our network participant agreement requires both parties to create a numbered record of this. So future tracking becomes possible. At least in India, e-commerce rules require that any e-commerce entity, which both the buyer and seller application will be, should have a grievance officer. So should a digital conversation between the two applications not resolve it, then the grievance officers need to get in touch with each other and resolve it. We're also building an online dispute resolution mechanism. So this digital history can be shared with a commonly agreed arbitrator by the two parties, and they can look at that history and provide that adjudication. So all these mechanisms exist. But the starting point for that are the terms and conditions for purchase. And that's true even on marketplaces today. So some items are returnable. Some are not returnable, but they're replaceable if damaged. Some are neither returnable nor replaceable. Some are only refundable. So there's no return path. If you ordered food, it was bad. If they return your money, then it's only refund. Right? Nobody's coming to collect the unused food back. All those mechanisms are available on our network.
Right.
And so a seller should first declare what are the terms on the basis of which they want to sell. And the buyers have a very easy one-click access to what those terms are before they can add to cart, as they have in marketplaces today.
Well, good to know both users and merchants have a legal recourse, and there's a mechanism in case they need to settle this. So that obviously helps. You did mention Singapore as one of the countries with whom you are engaging. Any other countries? UAE, US, Europe, anybody who you guys have spoken to?
There is interest from one of the existing participants for UAE. And so they're interested in cultivating that market. The good thing about both Singapore and UAE, particularly Dubai, is that the destination is a city.
Right.
So destination logistics are relatively simple. Second is both these countries depend a lot on imports. There's a much broader range of things that can be brought in. Some countries have restrictions, so that could be more challenging. And finally, both have a lot of Indian diaspora. So given that our network is largely based on Indian sellers, there's a large pool of buyers which will have an interest in buying stuff from India. Now, mind you, both places also have a lot of Indian stores. but no amount of Indian stores can really stock everything. And so if you want that particular thing from your hometown, that you know where to get, now you can actually order it digitally from the network once all this gets connected.
That sounds interesting indeed. In terms of what next for NDC? Obviously, the growth looks pretty staggering, but what are your number projections over the next 5 to 10 years? How big is this going to grow? Yeah, is the platform stable enough to handle this kind of volume? I know it's an API, so you're not hosting anything. But
correct.
Do you see any technological challenges from a scalability perspective? What are the number projections you guys have, both in terms of volume as well as users joining this platform, merchants, consumers? Any numbers that you can share?
Sure. So we do have projections, but remember, it's a little bit like going back 30 years and asking the internet creators, say, what are your projections for internet?
Correct.
Because it depends on what service. And so we lived through a .com bust, right? Back in the 90s where people tried stuff didn't work. But then in subsequent years, other things work. Social media work. So what's going to work when is actually not in the hands of the central protocol creation team. It's actually in the hands of people who imagine that service and build that service. Right. Some will succeed, will fail. Now, despite that, there is enough existing digital presence of various kinds. And so the easiest thing is for a lot of that to come. A lot of brands are interested because they see in this a solution to the challenges they always had. Doing e-commerce is expensive, but doing your own website or your own shopfront is challenging because you have no traffic. Now there's an opportunity to have both good margins as well as have access to traffic. So there's a lot of interest there. There's a lot of interest in sectors that people are backing. Right. So there are a lot of organizations, either as part of their CSR money or as part of their focus itself, who are backing rural entrepreneurship, who are backing women entrepreneurs. They have the budgets, they have the funds. So what we do is we create the program by which they can be onboarded and the funds come from there. So we are doing, for example, 50, how do you translate Mela? These are, aggregation events with farmers and farm producer organizations across 50 cities in this country, which is being funded by the Agriculture and Rural Development Bank. So we're bringing together the ecosystem to create that growth. Now, all this growth is on the basis of what we've already created. When we get into new sectors or a new use case, there needs to be sometimes an update of a protocol because each thing we buy requires a different exchange of information. So when I buy I buy a pen, I only have to describe the pen. But if I'm buying a jacket for myself, then I need to say male, size XL, so I need to tell about myself. If I'm hailing a ride, I need to give my location. So each product or service has a different information exchange. So part of it is as we bring one set of use cases on board, then we say, okay, then let's get the next set of use cases on board. So we have ready-made garments, let's go to tailored garments. In which case we have to create a protocol for sharing body measurements for that to be understood. So that's how we are adding like building blocks as we go along. In a diverse country like India, we have some additional challenges. One is language. And so the English Hindi approach can only reach so far. And so a lot of work is being done with Indic languages, not necessarily related to ONDC. It was taking place even otherwise. Yeah. And so we were working with organizations to bring those capabilities. So that's much more foundational. Some are practical and operational. Right? How do you onboard a grocery store? Because each grocery store has hundreds of SKUs and they're very different. And across the country, there are a lot of products that are very, very regional. So you can't have a single standard master list, but still create at least a system that can, let's say, convert 60-70% digitization easily. So building catalog as a service becomes one such resource that we need to create. So our journey is partly engaging with organizations and helping them literally get on board on their own, but also to identify then the new use cases, new geographies, new requirements that will help expand the reach of what we are creating. This is going to be a multi-year journey. But the good news is that with every success comes more confidence outside. So initially we just had 5 organizations. Today we have more than 70 that are live on the network. And now that 7 live, there are many more who are confident of at least exploring it. And so this is progress that feeds on itself. And hopefully we'll maintain that momentum in the years to come.
Shireesh, this is truly transformational. I can't have enough of this. The more I read about it, the more I see. I follow you on LinkedIn regularly, so I know exactly the number of vendors who are coming, the different parties which are coming and sign up on this particular platform. what also is pretty amazing about this is how it empowers the common man, especially the small business owners, some of these cottage industry owners, and really gives them access and a platform to showcase their wares, transact in a very effortless, easy manner. This is truly transformational. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been wonderful speaking to you. I hope to get you back on the podcast after a few more months, probably next year, to see how things have changed, what more is coming in from ONDC. But once again, thank you so much for giving us your time and talking to us today.
Sure, Samir. Happy to do it again. And as your viewers see this and have questions, I would be happy to engage with them and reply to whatever queries they may have.
Thank you, Shireesh.